Hi everybody and welcome to the End of the World Reading Club for August. So we're here to talk about The City in the Middle of the Night, and there is a spoiler warning. We haven't really done this before, but we probably should. We're going to get into quite a lot of what the book is about, so if you've not read it yet and you are planning on doing so and don't want to know what happens, then tune out now and come back and watch this on catch up so that you can see what's going on afterwards. So we're going to do the usual plan. I'm going to open up by talking about the book and what I liked about it, and then some of my theories, things that I'd like to talk about. Then open it up for comments and we'll take it from there. So the book we're talking about, The City in the Middle of the Night, is by the author Charlie Jane Anders. This is an American writer who founded a kind of tech nerd blog called IO9 with another author, Annalee Newitz, that's this one, who is also her life partner, and then turned into a writer, has written a lot of short stories, and then The City in the Middle of the Night is her third book, or second book, and then a collection of short stories, I think. There's some really interesting things about the life story of Charlie Jane Anders, which I think are quite pertinent to some of the things that happen in the story. I really recommend you check out her Wikipedia article, and we might mention a few of these. I'm always wary about bringing too much of a writer's personal life into a discussion of a work of literature, but I think in this case there's some interesting parallels with her life and her experiences and the book and what that deals with. But one of those that I do want to highlight, I suppose, right here is that Charlie Jane Anders has suffered from sensory processing disorder, which means it's quite difficult for her to deal with things coming in from the outside world, and I think that's got some really pertinent and relevance to the character of Sophie and how they deal with the world in this story. The last bit of admin about the book is it was published at the beginning of last year, 2019, by Titan, at least in this country, and I've got the paperback edition you can see a copy of somewhere there. So we'll kick off with a brief synopsis in case you haven't read it in a while. The City in the Middle of the Night is set on a tidally locked planet that's been settled by humans from various city-states. The planet has been named January for reasons that I'm not sure, but we might talk about in a little bit. And one thing that's really curious to me was that this city has not been founded by the usual suspects. So there aren't settlers from Britain or America, for example. There's Calgary, there's India, I think. Lots of different countries who are the kind of remaining city-states of Earth that have sent out this ship to colonise another planet, and they've landed on January. A really interesting, curious thing for me was that the action was preceded by a translator's note, which seemed to suggest this was the foundation myth for the next stage of human evolution. So there's a little tease there at the beginning, which I immediately forgot about. And I know I'm not the only one, because I read a blog review of this and they did exactly the same as me. And I think they probably then checked back in with the translator's note at the same point as me in the future and just went like that. So we'll talk about that in a bit. The action follows two characters. Sophie, who is a university student who is very shy and quiet, and is just starting to get involved in kind of political agitation, and Mouth, who is a smuggler or a courier, and the action takes place mostly in two cities on the planet of January, Zeosvant and Argalan, which are two main settlements. January is split between complete dark and complete light, and the cities occupy a little sliver of grey in the middle where humanity is able to survive. And the plot follows these two characters as their lives interact, and they're drawn into the political spheres of both cities and encounter the other life forms of the planet, most of which are incredibly hostile, but most importantly also include what they would refer to as the crocodiles. Sophie is in love with a fellow student called Bianca, and Mouth has got a close friend, Alyssa, and that relationship is slightly more complicated, but both relationships are very complex and have an impact on the plot and go throughout the story, and we'll talk a lot more about those relationships as we go. There are two themes which I think we're going to talk about continually throughout discussion of this book. We're going to keep coming back to them, and then I think at the end we're going to reflect on what the story and the characters and the ideas tell us about these two themes. And they are time and the idea of kind of yin and yang or binaries, so dark and light. I think these threads are really interesting and worth bearing in mind as we talk about the other things in the story. And we'll kick off with the setting. So I've also already mentioned the planet of January, which I think is really interesting. And when you look at the author's kind of notes at the end, there seem to be a lot of consultation with scientists about what a tidally locked planet might look like, and a concession that some of the science may have changed on that since the book was written. But it's based as much as possible on what scientists at the time thought might be the things that happened on a tidally locked planet. We've got two cities where the action mostly takes place. Zeusvant, which is the city of the dawn, and Argolan, which is the dusk city. So they are on two sides of this kind of grey sliver, separated by the cheerily named Sea of Murder. I think probably the Sea of Murder is a good indication of the darkness at the heart of this story. It can be quite a depressing story at some points. I think probably if you're going to read it and haven't yet, there's a bit of a trigger warning there. People go through some quite intense things and have to process those. So Zeusvant is where probably the bulk of the story is kind of set. It felt to me like this kind of spiritual home of the story. This is a very locked down, authoritarian control city. Everything is controlled by time. People sleep when they're told to sleep and they work when they're told to work. And everything is governed by regularity. Argolan is the opposite. It is a kind of almost kind of mafia-run, anarchic, hedonistic, wild city, where there aren't massive amounts of rules, and everything is a little bit kind of felt more frontiery, I suppose. So these are the two, and there time really doesn't play into the same way. It's all kind of do what you want when you want. So right away, we've got time and we've got this idea of opposites playing out in the two places where the world takes place. There is a third city, which is the titular city in the middle of the night. We will talk about that a bit later. Because it comes in quite late in the story, it doesn't quite feel like the setting to me in the same way. It feels more like a character, actually. So the planet as a whole is January. I thought this was a really interesting, curious name for a planet. I wondered whether this was either kind of the first mission to settle a new planet, maybe, or perhaps it's January because that's the beginning of the year, it's kind of rebirth. But I think that January is also quite a grey month. You don't have a lot of kind of rich plant life and things, so perhaps it also taps into the idea of it being a bit of a barren wasteland. So I really like the name of that. I tried to do a little bit of research into the names of the other two cities, but I don't know if I quite have a grasp on why they're called that, and maybe that's on purpose, so they're a little bit lost to us in translation. This happens in the future. So I'd love to know your theories about where those two names come from and what they might mean. If you want to go away and Google that while I'm talking, then that's great. Both of these cities are really well drawn as far as I'm concerned. They're rich with detail and with history. You get a real sense that these are lived in cities. I like the descriptions of the varying ages of these cities and how they overlap with each other. It feels like something that has evolved rather than it's just been plonked in a story, kind of brand new and shiny. As I mentioned, these two cities represent two sides of things: control versus order, and control and order versus anarchy and hedonism. But both of them are really dealing with things, dealing with a big thing in the same way, even if they don't quite realise it. And this is that the planet is dying. This third kind of theme is the impact that humans have on planets, on ecologies. So in this world, natural resources have been eroded, acid rain is on the rise, other kind of extreme weather events. And these two cities are dealing with it in very human ways. One is battening down the hatches, enforcing order and control, and the other is just let go and is like, what happens, we'll just party for as long as we can. And I think these are both very genuine ways that humans tend to deal with things like this, and there's some nice kind of historical allusions, I think, to some societies that have dealt with this in the past. I think Zeosvant in particular is something like the Hidden City maybe in China, which was a kind of a regression from the world in the 15th century, and they're kind of just trying to keep everybody out and having control over what you can control. So let's talk about characters. We've got two here. The first one is Sophie. As I mentioned at the outset, Sophie is an introverted and possibly autistic character, really struggles to articulate her emotions. One thing that was really interesting to me was the narratives that these two are told in, and I think when you get to the end of the novel, this becomes really apparent as to why there are these changes. But I think there's also something here in the storyteller using them to give us different experiences. So Sophie's story is told kind of first person, and it's present tense mostly. So this is like we're following somebody's experience. This is really useful, I think, because Sophie is so introverted. If we were observing her from the outside or from another character, as we do through Mouth, you would get almost nothing. It's all an interior world. And then Mouth is the opposite, our other narrator, a lot louder and more brash, and this is a kind of third person past tense narrative voice. This is great, I think, because Mouth is a lot more likely to is a lot more plain spoken and a lot more likely to articulate, whether they mean to or not, what they're thinking, what they're feeling. Mouth says, I'm good at reckoning distances, I'm not so good at figuring out new or far from abstract ideas. So kind of plain spoken and kind of really down the line, at least on the outside, whereas the internal is kind of unknown, even to Mouth. So there's something really nice there about that these two narrative approaches, which kind of sit alongside each other, alternating, also says something about their characters and something about the story and kind of where we end up, and particularly where Sophie ends up, and why we're hearing her story in a different way. So both of these characters are on a journey to find out who they are. They're both in kind of slightly odd and slightly toxic relationships, I suppose, both with other people and with their pasts. So Sophie is a kind of a working class girl who's gone to university and is mixing with other social classes. And this is encapsulated in the character of Bianca. So Bianca is kind of her best friend. There's a really nice tradition of sleep mates. So you're always kind of bedding with somebody. A lot of characters are doing this, and that's not necessarily a relationship, although it can be. So Bianca is Sophie's sleepmate, but is also a girl that she's in love with because she seems exciting and dynamic. This is a regular trope, I think. But one thing that's really interesting is that all the way through the novel, Sophie can't let go of Bianca. She can't let go of the hope that she's the genuine article, rather than actually her kind of performative radicalism. It's a really toxic relationship. Bianca doesn't treat her very well at almost any point, and in fact uses Sophie's suffering for her own benefit. And I think as a reader, you're supposed to, as I did, struggle and kind of shout at the book for Sophie to just leave her and let go and move on. But there's something very real about that idea of somebody you can't let a relationship go. And probably something really important about Sophie's character is that she can't let go, because her relationship with the Galette, with the crocodiles, comes about partly because she's got a big, forgiving heart and she wants to believe in hope and change and something more. And there's a transference at the end from Bianca to the Galette and their vision of the future, which the whole way that she's experienced the world feeds into the fact she's receptive to that and the changes that she undergoes. So I think there's something redeeming about her relationship with Bianca. Alyssa is a much different character. This is Mouth's friend. I think we're supposed to read them as just really close friends rather than anything more. I really liked Alyssa. She's very, again, plain spoken, and she's a good balance with Mouth and one thing that's really nice about all these kind of four, and I think they've got there's probably some kind of Venn diagram system you could do between these four characters. They kind of balance each other out, or complement, or control, or read the other components of this dynamic. And there's this there's a couple of ideas within the story that hint at these kind of things. There's the anchor banter, which is never quite articulated what that is, and this idea of somebody having a jinx. And I think there's different jinxes and different anchor banters between these characters as the story evolves. I'd love to know your thoughts on those dynamics. There are many, many other characters, some of which we get to know pretty well, and some of whom we think we're going to know very well and then meet a grisly end pretty quickly, often on the Sea of Murder or somewhere else in the wilds. But the other kind of characters, and I don't think there's one in particular that you could necessarily have, is the galettes, the crocodiles. I'd love to know your thoughts on them. So this is an alien species, and they brought to mind, when I was reflecting on the story, of the aliens in Arrival, the film Arrival, and the book of which it's based on, because they also represent these two themes in interesting ways. They have a very radical approach to time, in that they share these memories with each other, they share these stories with each other. So actually they can see the world in a different way. And they also only have one gender, so they also have a different perspective on that, and you get that is a comment, I suppose, on these two themes of time and kind of yin and yang and opposites. This is a species that don't necessarily have the same approach to either of those things that humans do, and perhaps give them a different perspective on the world, which allows them to be more forward-thinking and more radical in their approaches to the challenges that the planet is under. So to move on to this idea of opposites, I was reading some of the other reviews and commentary on this, and I thought this was a nice piece from the Barnes & Noble blog about this book when it came out. The two cities are light and darkness, dawn and dusk. Travelling through them alongside Sophie and Mouth is startling and revealing. Anders asks the reader to engage with both the city's bright and dark sides, a bone-deep examination of the pros and cons of strict Marxist Sierfant, where no mouth goes hungry, but time and duty is strictly enforced, and the police rule with an iron fist, and free-flowing libertarian Argolan, where time has no meaning and freedom reigns, but the gap between the haves and the have-nots is a gaping chasm. So there's a lot there, I think, about this idea of kind of yin and yang, and about the grey in between, I suppose. I think both of the cities and all of the characters who are in these dynamics, they struggle when they're on their own. Sierfant and Argolo need each other. They need the smugglers. They need that. They need Mouth and Alyssa and the others to ferry supplies between the two. They can't exist in a bubble. And in the same way, the characters can't exist in a bubble either. And some, I think, of the journey of the characters is to work out which symbiotic relationships make the most sense for them. So for Sophie, she thinks it's Bianca, but actually it's not. It's the Galette. And Mouth maybe just needs to realise that there's already some pretty decent relationships that she should prioritise rather than what she does do. The other thing that is the other reason why I'm using yin and yang is this sleepmates thing. There's something there about the characters kind of curling up together to sleep, which really reminded me of that yin and yang symbol. This isn't necessarily a theme which is talking about something that's straight down the middle like January is. Humans are more complex than that. The planet's more complex than that. So I think actually that symbol of the two kind of clustered together is maybe one that I try and keep in mind more than anything else. So this is the end of the World Reading Club, and this is to some extent a book about the end of the world. And I think probably as I was reading it, that was less immediate to me as I was going through than it was at the end. and as I was reflecting on the story. So we're in a situation where the humans have broken January. The culprits, the citizens really, but also all of the settlers, have kind of done this without realising. I think this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One of which is that these are human beings who have travelled here from Earth that is shown to have kind of failed because of kind of climate change. So these are humans that should know better. They've had to, as a species, already deal with one planet dying, and they haven't arrived at a new one with a new sense of responsibility for where they've come to, and with a new approach to figuring out how do we live within this world. I was reminded, I was reading of a book we talked about in our first book club, Semiosis, and how the humans there learn to have a symbiotic relationship with the planet of which they've landed. January is clearly somewhere where this has not happened, and that humanity has not learnt its lessons from Earth. So the other thing this is interesting for me, and I've touched on this a little bit briefly before, I suppose, in my comments, is that how do we move forward as a species so that we can look at the long-term view and we can deal with things like climate change and impacting a planet and be more responsible. And I think the author's thesis here is that there needs to be an evolution of what we're doing, and she uses the Galette to demonstrate the ways that we need to think as a species and operate as a species better to be able to do this. So some of this comes down to better communication, more open and honest communication, but also not being so concerned with what's happening 5 minutes from now, not being stuck to the clock, but also not forgetting the march of time. It's more about stepping back and taking the long view, planning for the future, thinking collectively, how do we get from here to there, and how do we do that? And the sense you get from the translator's note, I think, is that this has maybe happened, and that a new evolved humanity, which is kind of part Galette and part human, has sorted this out and has gone out into the universe to colonize in a more responsible way. There was a quote that really stuck out to me as I was reading this, which I think encapsulates this idea. And this is a quote from when there is essentially like a civil war in Argolo. Two men ran past. They held a sheet of metal over their heads, which would fall unless they both held it up. They kept slashing at each other with knives in their spare hands. I think this is a perfect metaphor for how human beings tend to look at things like climate change. It's not about how can we as a global society fix a problem. It's how can I look after myself. In this case, the sheet of metal is protecting the men from acid rain. It's how can I simultaneously protect myself and help. We can work together to protect ourselves, but also I'm going to be trying to stab you in the back and get whatever I can for myself. I think this was the kind of key quote for me in that climate changey end of the world bit. So to move on to the ending. I was reading quite a lot of coverage of this book which talked about the ending being very sudden, and I have to agree. This book's about 500 pages long, I think. I could have happily had it 600 and had a slightly protracted ending. But I don't think this is necessarily an accident or bad writing. I think it's a deliberate choice that it ends where it ends. And actually maybe the journey and the character development is really the point, because those themes and the thesis of what humans need to become, that's the important thing here. It's not necessarily the saving of the planet or the reforming of the societies. It's a first step on the rung. If there was a sequel to this book, I would not be entirely surprised. I'd love it to be called February, if there is going to be one. But yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments on how you thought this book ended, and whether it was satisfying for you or whether you were kind of left wanting a little bit more. I'm kind of probably a bit 50-50, but I can on reflection, I think, rather than at the time, I can see the benefits of it. So some other observations. We always do the other observations. So it was about page 345 in that paperback edition that I went back and read the translator's note, having completely forgotten it, and it absolutely blew my mind. I think it was just the right point for me in the story, because I was just starting to think, I'm sure I remember something about kind of post-human development and evolution. I wonder what that translator's note said. And I kind of went back, and then I was basically then set up for the last bit of the book. I almost wonder whether that translator's note needs to come in there, because that's probably the same point, or roughly, that one of the blog reviews I read said, I forgot about that note, and then suddenly near the end I went back and read it. And I thought that was really nice, because quite often with those kind of translator's notes, I think you do forget them until maybe the end of the book and go back, but it seemed like it was a nice point. Another thing that really struck me when I was doing the background research was from the author. They used to live in a Buddhist nunnery when they were a teenager, and I thought that was really interesting. I thought it was really interesting for this idea of being governed by time, but also thinking about the Illyrian parlour. So this is a setting that we haven't talked about yet, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because I think this is a really interesting part of the book. So the Illyrian parlour is a cafe that Sophie escapes to when she's been left to die outside of the city of Zeaphant. And it is a place that is not concerned with time. It's like slow time. And I felt as I was reading that this was a place where Sophie was training to slow down and to take the long view, which meant that she was then more ready for the transition that she goes through towards the end of the novel. And this life experience from the author of being in maybe in that kind of slow meditative environment, I think comes through both in the physical parlour, but also in some of these ideas of time, perhaps, and having a different worldview. I also thought it was worth us talking about the citizens. I think these are really interesting, but I'm not 100% sure what they represent. So if you haven't read the book in a while, the citizens are mouths people. They are a kind of nomadic religion who travel around the Grey, kind of going on walkabout to kind of gain enlightenment, I think. So mouths got a big beef with them because they refused to give her a name and to thus kind of give her that kind of adult status, and then they're all wiped out. There are events at the end of the novel which I probably won't go too spoilery into, because I think you could probably still have those experiences and those surprises if you've watched all of this. But you get a very different perspective on the citizens at the end of the novel than you may have done through Mouth's ideas. I suppose one of the things that they represent is Mouth's own journey. We've talked a lot about Sophie, but not so much about Mouth. I read an interesting review on a blog about this, that Mouth is a bit of a blank canvas at the beginning, and Mouth doesn't entirely know who she is when the story starts, and perhaps has got a better idea by the end. And I think the argument in the review was that this isn't necessarily a satisfying story, but I think it worked really nicely. I like this idea that somebody who had lost everything was trying to find meaning, and really kind of finding meaning in the wrong places, finding meaning by nihilism, by anarchy, by being a bit of an outlaw, trying to construct a identity through those kind of actions, and trying to recapture perhaps what childhood was. So having a nomadic childhood and then turning that into a kind of nomadic adulthood, being a courier and a smuggler and a kind of huntery kind of character. And I think her knowledge of the citizens and her knowledge of herself probably have got some nice parallels which you could go through and track in the book. So let me know your thoughts on that. Here's another thing that stood out to me. because I'm always interested in the long-term histories of alien races. My question is, where did the Galak come from? I suppose I struggled to imagine that this was a species that evolved on January. It just feels like a too hospitable planet for that, if that makes sense. So I wondered whether these were another species that came from somewhere else, because that wouldn't be 100% a surprise. And it would be quite interesting, I think, if they were also colonisers. And I was trying to think, and I didn't have time to check it back when I was preparing for this, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But I think the memories of the species don't go all the way back to their evolution. They kind of start at a certain point, which could be construed as a point where they decide as a species to evolve to fit more closely with the planet, which is kind of what humans are doing by the end, I suppose. Some of them have made the decision that they're going to evolve to be part of the planet rather than on the planet. So what do you think? Do you think this is a species that's come from somewhere else, and then they've gradually evolved to survive, or do you think they're indigenous and they have evolved to survive? It'd be great to know what you think. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting about them was the fact that they live in the dark at the city in the middle of the night, because I think some of the other themes of the story seem to suggest that that grey is kind of where the things are most interesting to happen. But does living somewhere light and dark with a need to find your own grey, which they maybe do underground, inspire this kind of evolution? So I'm going to sum up now. I've been talking for far too long, so please start popping your comments in so that we can get into the discussion side. There's some things that I think probably I'd like to discuss further. One of those, which we haven't talked about yet, is about how this idea of how people respond to extreme conditions. Both of the main characters and all of the species involved go through extreme experiences and live in extreme environments. So Sophie in particular has been is very early in the story, is kind of left to die and is saved and lives with that trauma for the rest of the story. Mouth losing her family young and then having to try and find out who she is on her own is similarly quite a traumatic experience. And then throughout the novel there is lots of loss and disappointment, and also lots of failure. I thought that was really interesting. Quite often in science fiction, fantasy stories, you get heroic characters who perhaps do fail a little bit early on, but then their journey is about them becoming good enough to succeed. I'm not sure at any point any of these characters entirely succeed at almost anything. There is so much failure in here, and I would love to read more things which are more concerned with how people deal with kind of traumatic and extreme things, but also how they deal with failure, and that's okay. These are the people that we are supposed to not necessarily identify with, but these are the kind of heroes of our story, and they quite often get it really wrong. And Sophie with Bianca is just incredibly frustrating, but you can't help but root for them all the same, and I think that's really nice and really interesting. One of the other things that stuck out to me was the differences between revolution or evolution. So in particular, I was thinking in the context of Zeusvant, the city. This is a powder keg of a place. Authoritarian rule is causing people to think about rebelling, and particularly the younger generation. Do you think the author believes in kind of revolution or evolution? Because both of these are modelled here. I think it's probably more like evolution, because I think revolution fails, and I think what the author is normally mentions, he's talking about, is that revolution quite often doesn't cause real change because it's just different faces for the same problems, whereas evolution is bringing a different mindset to the same challenges. I'd love to know if you agree with that or not. Just last night I was listening to a podcast about Duarte in the Philippines. I think it was Duarte, or maybe it was another kind of strongman. It's a Misha Glenny podcast, and that podcast really shows that even if somebody stands on a platform of changing the status quo, it doesn't take very long for them to then become exactly the same status quo, because the challenges and the mindset don't really change. And what do you do to hold on to power when you've got power? So there's definitely something in there for me. And Hammers Home, I think this is quite a political novel in a way that good sci-fi is, that it's about now. And quite a lot of the blogs, I think, suggest that this is a novel that really is. It could only have been written about now. It also felt like a really personal book to me. Not quite a diary, maybe, and this is where we're going to touch, I think, on the life story of the author, which I said at the beginning I don't like doing too much because this is fiction and it's not necessarily a diary. But Charlie Jane Anders is a trans woman and has been through that process of figuring out their identity and how they present their identity to the world. And for me, the characters in this story and the journeys they go on feel like they're informed by that really personal experience of doing that, and those life experiences. So yeah, great to know your thoughts on how you think that all kind of plays into this. And then the very last thing I've got down on my notes is from another review, that this novel puts a human face and heart to society's greatest problems: class inequality, prejudice, thoughtlessness, and environmental indifference. Now, some of these things I've not talked about because I was a lot more interested in the kind of time and this idea of symbiosis, I suppose. But it just points that there was a lot more in this story to talk about. So if you've picked up on those things instead of what I've been mentioning, then drop them in the comments and we'll have a little chat about that. We have got about 20 minutes left, so put some comments in. I'm going to take a sip of coffee and then we will get into those. So while I wait for you to leave your comments and your thoughts, I thought I would just bring up, I've got here the reading guide from litlovers.com about this book. It's probably a different approach to looking at the story than I normally take, but there's probably about, there's 14 questions on here which they recommend that you think about when you're reading the story or after you've read the story and you want to discuss it. So I thought there might be a few things on here that we can pick up, and there might also be things which you might be interested in yourselves. So I'm going to pop the link in the chat if you're interested. The first question on here is, of course we're meant to like Sophie, and we do. What characteristics does she possess that make her likeable, admirable even, and what do you see as her flaws? And actually this is an interesting question because I think I alluded to at the beginning that some of the things that are probably character flaws, I would say, are really necessary for her place in the story and in the this evolution of humankind. She's incredibly loyal. She might be the most loyal character I've written a book for ages. And I think in some ways that loyalty is a flaw because it's an uncritical loyalty. But in the end, that open-hearted loyalty is what means that she's open to the Galette and open to change and trusts in them and their honesty about what they want to do with her. And I think that's probably the same characteristic, which is kind of good and bad. But she probably should ditch Bianca earlier, right? Like almost immediately. I think that was quite obvious from the way it was written. And I wonder if this is also based on a bit of a personal experience from the author of a friendship that they wish they'd jettisoned a bit earlier than they did. I'm just scrolling down here now, see what other things we've got on the list. They also ask us in this list to consider, this is number 4, consider the passage about the city of Zeusfant. The founders of that city had a valid theory of human nature, but they took it too far. That's the problem with grand social ideas in general. They break if you put too much weight on them. So the questions that are related to this are, what is the valid theory that they propound and how do they take it too far? And how would you describe living in this city? And actually this is something that I did want to talk about. I was thinking about this morning as I was getting ready. This novel was published last year in a world that was very different from the one that we're in now. And we probably live, at least in the UK and in other parts of the world, in a society that is a lot closer to Zeusfant than it was in February this year, let alone February last year. And society generally has recognised a big challenge and has accepted that the way that we have to deal with that challenge is to go into lockdown. And Zeusfant, to a large degree, is a city that's in permanent lockdown. And I think a year ago, I'd have read this story thinking, what a horrendous place to live. I couldn't sleep when somebody tells me to sleep, that's for sure. You don't get bags under your eyes like this with that kind of attitude to life or with that kind of sleep pattern. But that actually, when circumstances dictate, you have to make some sacrifices. But obviously the founders of the city have taken it too far. And we haven't talked at all about this circadian revolution and the idea of living within sleep patterns. I wonder if this came from some of the work that, some of the research and the scientific things that were coming out about sleep patterns. It's been quite a popular genre in non-fiction publishing over the last few years, telling people how to sleep better. So this definitely feels like it's taken it a bit too far. But here's the thing: is this a grand social idea that comes from a place of kind of utopian ideals, or is this an idea that comes from things are really tough, we need to survive, everything is running out, how do we keep alive for as long as we can? My feeling is that this is a reductive way of doing things. This is saying we have given up, but we're going to string it out for as long as possible, rather than what humanity is really good at, which is ingenuity and problem solving. And when a problem feels immediate, then we can find ways to tackle it. So there's definitely something there, which is perhaps that this isn't humanity's finest hour, circadian revolution. And then the follow-up to that is the kind of grand social ideas. How might that statement apply to our own world's history of grand ideas? Monarchy, democracy, capitalism, socialism, communism, religion. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that other review's description of Zeusfant as Marxist. I wonder if to some degree the story or the writer is critiquing theories of what that kind of authoritarian Marxism might look like. I suppose it does hark back to kind of Stalin's 5-year plan and that very regimented, controlled way of living, which is very different from the kind of utopian socialism you get from the Galette. Theirs is a world which is full of interdependency and sharing of resources, but without the stick of control. Everybody's bought into this idea of the social good. And that's a grand idea in its own way, and I think the story posits that that is a much better way, there is a grand idea that works. We just aren't ready yet as a species to accept it. So to move on to the Galette, another one of these questions is, are you able to overcome the fact they look like giant lobsters? I don't really talk about the fact they were like giant lobsters, and talk about the connection that Sophie develops with them, what she learns from them. This, again, a really interesting viewpoint, and maybe a critique of how other science fiction maybe treats alien races to some degree. And there's a kind of body horror element. I think in a lot of fiction, aliens look weird and then they kind of are weird. Not always, and there's some really, really notable exceptions. I'm thinking particularly of the writing of Ian Banks, and I think actually the Galette are reminiscent of some of those alien species which are really weird, and have got lots of tentacles and things, but are very lovely. I would find it challenging, I think, to trust a giant lobster who wanted to put a sucker on my face, but Sophie kind of didn't have a lot of choice, I suppose, at the time. But at least she was open to the idea of connection, and perhaps suggests that we should all be more open to the ideas of connection as well. And the next question on here kind of talks a bit about the humans on January's relationship to what they call the crocodiles, that they're kind of hunted and killed without real examination of how sentient they are. And this does surely represent, just like other aspects of how January is treated by the settlers, that humans struggle to treat the environment in a way that isn't transactional and that isn't based on how humans think they're entitled to everything that's around them and it's for their use. The citizens also do this with the harvesting of those of the Galette's kind of planet venting stuff in a very thoughtless way, and that is that thoughtlessness which maybe goes throughout both the kind of bigger story of humans on the planet, but also maybe the smaller story of the experiences that happen to individual characters throughout. And there's a lot of very thoughtless humans in this story. Why don't we end by talking a little bit about Mouth, because it's easy, I think, to talk about Sophie in this story. We're inside of her head, we're inside of her world, but Mouth is a lot more unknowable. I definitely found her harder to warm to, but I think as Mouth figures out who she is as the story evolves, I think we find it easier to identify with her and her experiences, and I think that's a really nice thing, that it's not just a kind of fixed point for her. It's something that evolves. You don't necessarily get that all the time. Yeah, so I think Mouth is quite an interesting character with regard to the story in general, I suppose. Please leave a comment of what you think of Mouth and Mouth's experience of the story, and whether you think she's a sympathetic character, and I suppose where she fits in with this broader story that we're kind of getting to here. I feel as I'm talking and thinking about it that maybe she reflects a lot more the journey that the settlers have to go on, or are refusing to go on for a long time, and even at the end with the resistance to following Sophie's path. She represents the intractable side of humanity, that it's very difficult for her to be open to new things and to change. She's so fixated on that point of trauma in her past that she really finds it difficult to move past it. And this perhaps represents humans that have landed on January. They are fixed on several points, either on the fleeing of Earth and the societies that were left behind. The Illyrian parlour is perhaps representative of that. but also the things that happened on the mothership, on the travel, the massacre that's hinted at, the retaining of some of the prejudices that humans have arrived on January with. Mouth represents to us some of those issues that humans have about knowing who they are and knowing who they want to be and being brave enough to make those steps. And that brings us very nicely back to the yin and yang of Sophie and Mouth. That Sophie represents humanity's openness to change and evolution, and maybe Mouth represents the slowness of humanity to change and to move on and to treat adversity and problems as an opportunity for change rather than as something that hardens existing ideas and prejudices and thoughts. That's, if you've not read the novel, and I haven't spoiled it too much for you, maybe those are things that you can think about as you're reading it and as you're putting the characters kind of straight in your mind. I'm just going to see if there's one more thing on here we might want to talk about. So the book suggests that humans can never be brought to care about the plight of those whom they find repulsive or to share concern about the damage they've caused to the planet. Do you find this trait realistic, or is the novel's view of humanity too dark and fatalistic? And I don't necessarily agree, I think, with that analysis of the book. I think Sophie's there to remind us that humans can care, and that all big societal shifts and changes start from small beginnings. It needs one or two people to have that idea, to want to make that change, and then others will gradually follow if the idea is right. And right at the end of the novel, you see that change just starting to happen. And perhaps that's why the ending is so abrupt, or feels so abrupt. Because actually the end of the journey is putting Sophie in the place where she has that influence on people, and that the boulder is starting to go down the hillside, and we know from the translator's note that eventually that becomes the avalanche, and that is the point, and that what we need in society are people to make that choice, make that change, and light the way. And perhaps here the author is thinking about someone like Greta Thunberg, being a articulate, open, passionate voice that can frame things in a way that humans can understand, and to provide ways of thinking about alternative ways of doing things. You need that lodestone, that touch point. So I'm not sure. I think the novel has got a dark view of a lot of humanity, but perhaps has some wisdom there that it's difficult for large crowds and for big populations to change, and that's why Bianca's revolution fails, because actually they aren't clear enough about articulating the why. The revolutionaries are interested in the why because they don't like their life, but they're not necessarily interested in the underlying reasons why. And kind of just linking back into the climate change side of things, is this where this is kind of coming from? That there are a lot of people that know that a change is necessary, and they know that we need to find different ways of living our lives, but they aren't necessarily engaged because life is busy and there's a lot of other things to worry about, with the really deeper questions of who are we as human beings, how do we operate in our planet, and that is going to be a gradual process of evolution, but that we need people to speed that along who are brave and go out there and take a risk and do things differently and prove, like Sophie's done by the end of the novel, that it's okay to do things really differently and you can survive it and be stronger from it. So perhaps there's something there in the story that's actually light at the end, which is that we can have an impact and we can make a change, but we need to be open and brave and ready to go. So we are probably 3 minutes before the end, but I probably have run out of things to say. So unless there is any other little comments that people want to drop in, I'm going to bring the feed to a close. Before I go, you may see that there is a little link down in the bottom left-hand corner. That is for our recently launched crowdfunder. We are in the process of putting together our program for this year's Cosmere. It's going to be an online festival. There will be some reading clubs like this, but also authors talking about their works, artists who are producing work, lots of other interesting stuff. There will be a quiz, I'm sure. But we need some support from you to make sure this happens. Even running an online festival costs money. We want to pay authors for their time. We want to pay artists for their time. We need to pay for the streaming services to give you a high quality product. All of that costs money, and we can't do it without some support from all of you out there. So if you've got any resources that you can spare, you can visit that crowdfunder over the next 4 weeks. Anything that you can give us towards running the festival this year will be really appreciated, and we can't wait to see you then. Our next book club is it will be in September, and then there will be 2 during the festival period. There'll be one in the end of October, and there'll be another one the following week at the beginning of November. So what we're going to do is announce the next 3 books all in one go, so you can get them all lined up to read. We'll probably do a post at the end of next week, so at the end of August, to tell you what those books are, and then you can kind of get reading and start looking forward to the reading clubs that are going to be coming in September, October and November. When we get to the end of the festival, we'll probably take a break from the end of the world style events and books, and probably do a bit of a palette cleanser or 2. If you watched our haul video, which is over on our YouTube channel, there's at least one book on there, Rather Weird, by Andrew Caldecott, which we'll talk about in the end of November or the end of December, because it's a really cool book and it's not as apocalyptic as some of the things we've been talking about. So we look forward to talking about other books with you in the future. As ever, stay safe, and we will see you soon.